Hello HEMA friends and welcome to this new video. Today I'm going to discuss the subject of sideways stepping lateral movement while fencing with every sword, but especially with the longsword. Now, in my understanding, sideways movement, lateral movement is sometimes misunderstood in a sense that it is discussed a lot sometimes in certain environments. But it's not really easy to understand where it should be placed and when during the fight. Now let's start with a simple concept actually, which is the farther away you are from the opponent and the more you move sideways, the lesser is the impact of your lateral movement. Why? Simply because you need a lot of time to execute a big movement when you are farther away, and the opponent needs a tiny little bit of time to understand that you're doing it and just adjust a little by rotating on the spot. While instead, if you move sideways just a tiny little bit, just a few centimeters, by moving maybe only the back foot sideways, you are already changing the line. Of course, the movement is so tiny that it requires lesser time, and it is, which is even more important, harder to spot from the outside. Now, this principle is also true on the opposite side of the spectrum, in a sense that if you are close to the opponent, it is important, if you want to move sideways in a relevant way. Now imagine if you are knowledgeable of Fiore fencing, that the opponent is coming at you and it is a strong in the bind, maybe with a thrust in opposition, and you want to yield under the opponent's strength, under the opponent's opposition. Now to do it is far better to execute the motion while moving sideways in a relevant way. This happens because the opponent is coming at you, so you also have time because the opponent is already doing something, but also because you get closer and closer with the opponent, and the closer you get, the better it is to move sideways in a relevant way, so that you move away from the attack line, and for the opponent blade, it's harder to reach you in whatever way it may happen. Now, why this is kind of a rule, we can say? Well, simply because of the motivations which I mentioned. Now, the farther away you are, the lesser your sideways movement is relevant because of the distance. And the changing in the attack line in relation to a single spot, which is the opponent, even if your movement is giant, is not relevant at all, basically. Instead, if you are close to the opponent, think about two boxing athletes fighting each other very, very close, and think about their sideways movement. How relevant is that movement compared to the one you may execute while being out of reach compared to your opponent with sword in hand, because the distance is far, far longer. Now, this is true also when you are fencing with the sword in hand. The closer you get with the opponent because you are attacking, or because the opponent is attacking you and you are reacting, etc., etc., the more your sideways movement gets relevant if you execute it in a wide way, in a sense that you execute a big movement, a huge movement. The opposite is true, as I mentioned, for farther away. When you are farther away, tiny movements on the sides, which may be useful for what, for instance? For taking the bind, for instance. If I take the bind and I am on an attack line and I am strong in the bind, if before I start thrusting I move sideways by just a 5 centimeters, my blade moves aside by more or less the same amount of centimeters, and if I am already strong in the bind, or if I have the occasion to be strong in the bind because I am applying the bind in that movement, my strength gets multiplied by that side movement. But it must be tiny in the amount of space that you breach, which means also tiny in the amount of time that you need to breach that space. That's crucial, actually. Now, if we take in consideration this, we may create a rule, as I mentioned, which may be this one. Now, when you think about lateral movement, you have to think it in this way. So imagine that you are out of reach, just a tiny little bit out of reach, 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters. You are ready to enter at a distance from which, with a single movement, you can hit the hands or forearms of the opponent. That's the distance that we are thinking about. From that distance, from your front foot, you have to imagine a triangle which is projected toward your opponent. Now, that triangle represents how much you should move sideways at the various distance that are between you and the opponent. Now, when you are at the engaging distance, basically, or outside of it, a tiny little bit outside of it, you need to move just a tiny bit sideways to obtain a relevant objective. If you do something more, it's a bad idea. If you are instead approaching the opponent with a complex actions and you are breaching distance and you are getting more and more into distance, you can already plan for side movements. You can plan for side movements which are wider, which are, let's say, more exaggerated the more you get closer with the opponent. And so if your plan is to reach medium distance, you still have to plan for relatively small sideways movement, which may be useful to get strength in the bind if you are thrusting at the opponent, or just yell at the opponent to attack from another angle, and so on, depending from which one is your plan. Or you can simply go straight, because it is always a very good option in the greatest majority of the occasions. Not always, of course. Plus, sideways movement is more complex to plan. Remember, that's something that you have to keep in mind when you are planning an action. Anyway, when you reach basically straight to distance, you can also think about very wide movement and try to rotate around the opponent. Think about, for instance, like in Fiore, there is an action which pushes the elbow of the opponent sideways. Now, you can do it frontally, but it's not easy. You can even instead move aside and even rotate on the spot, and you create a huge leverage in this sense. This is easier to do when you get closer to the opponent. But remember that, of course, the opponent is able to do the same thing, basically. Instead of you says that the first one who acts is the one who has the advantage. No, this is always true. So if you are the first one which is moving sideways, it is better for you. If the opponent does it first, better for them. So this is a simple concept which I wanted to pass you today, because I sometimes see people which maybe are approaching the opponent from out of distance, and they start to circle around the opponent a lot by moving the feet in a crosswise way, you know, etc., but remaining at the same distance, or just entering a tiny little bit into space. This thing is, conceptually speaking, not stupid to do, but it is so complex that it becomes irrelevant. In a sense that if you are just circling around the opponent, it doesn't make sense. If you are out of distance and you're circling about the opponent can just rotate on the spot. It takes lesser time, and the opponent compensates for your rotation in lesser time that you need to rotate, basically. Instead, if you try to approach the opponent in a spiraling motion, let's say, which is theoretically speaking a very, very smart thing to do, you are still doing something that it is so complex that it's almost not relevant, because think about dealing with distance on a straight line. If you are fencing since enough time, you probably know that even dealing with distance in a proper way while remaining on a straight line is not easy. Think about dealing with distance while circling with cross-stepping around your opponent, while approaching them with a spiraling motion. It's something which, in my opinion, while theoretically possible, goes beyond the qualities that the standard human may have. For sure there is someone which is able to do it, but it will be the exception which confirms the rule and not the opposite. Now, one last thing about lateral movement, which instead is useful while using especially the longsword. Why? Well, because it's a peculiar weapon, and you can move sideways also, not only in the way which I described, but you can also move sideways while stepping forward, but in another direction. And you're probably saying, what this means, Federico, it doesn't make sense. Well, let me show you. So, if you have the front foot forward, of course, when you are doing your steps, you move forward and backward. But by keeping the same guard, namely the same position of your sword, which may obtain the same result in a sense of striking an overhand, and your foot just rotates 20 degrees maybe, or even 10, toward the side, every time you're stepping forward, you're also stepping sideways. And this way of approaching lateral movement with the longsword, when you are fencing an opponent, especially from out of distance, when you are engaging even from out of distance, it's very useful if you want to plan an action which uses sideways movement to change the attack line. So maybe imagine that I am taking the bind on the opponent's sword. I simply step forward, but my step forward, because I'm stepping in another direction, is also stepping sideways. And this position of my hips also, funny enough, helps you stepping forward with the next action. So, there are ways, relevant ways, of moving sideways while fencing with the longsword especially, not only, but this example is true especially with the longsword. There are ways of moving sideways which are relevant and other which are less relevant. When you are moving sideways, you have to consider how much you are moving sideways depending from the distance that intercur between you and the opponent, and plan it accordingly. You have to still remember that it's a complex plan, especially under stress. When you are under stress, moving sideways is very, very, very complex. Now imagine that the person in the TV show which is running away from the boulder which is going downhill, and you're asking yourself why that person is not running sideways instead of going down. It will be better. Indeed, it will be better, but imagine a person under stress. It's not always possible to save yourself in the smartest way possible when you are under stress. You are acting out of instinct sometimes, and in fighting this thing may happen. And sometimes it happens constantly if you are under-trained or you are not trained at all. So remember that this is a complex plan which requires even more skill than the standard forward and backward movement, which especially at the beginning and also at an average level, it should be the best and the most important way to do movement that you have to learn. Then you can start applying sideways movement in the most smart way that you may know and apply, as the one I am showing you, or better talking about you today. In a future video I will show you some ways to sidestep in a better way. Maybe I will shoot a couple videos on the subject depending from where and at which time you should apply the lateral movement, we will see. But for now, let's stop here with the theory. I suspect you will find it useful in some ways. Thanks for watching as always, people, and see you next time.